Russia's invasion of Ukraine is worsening the global threat of hunger and starvation. Russia and Ukraine are major suppliers of wheat, cooking oil and other food staples. Exports are now being disrupted, pushing prices higher and making food more unaffordable for the world's most impoverished people. Now, humanitarian relief is also being affected. In 2021, Ukraine was the largest single source of food for the UN's World Food Programme, which works to feed the most vulnerable around the world. Now, in Eastern Africa, the situation is particularly dire. The effects of climate change are being compounded by regional conflicts. And now the knock-on effects of Russia's war in Europe are exacerbating the crisis. Now, while part of the region is experiencing its worst drought in 40 years, South Sudan has been hit by severe flooding. Now, that makes outside supplies of food and grain even more vital.
Nialoka Puok's garden is flooded. She tries desperately to rebuild her small embankment. In her village, Paguir, residents have built canoes to move themselves around as their cattle perish in the floodwaters. It's the third year in a row that they've had to fight the effects of heavy flooding.
The water's taken everything from me. My land, my home, my food was swept away. The floods came 2 years ago. Since then, we've lived in water. We try our best, but the water beats us.
A large part of South Sudan has been hit by the worst flooding in 60 years. Nearly 1 million people are suffering the consequences. The catastrophe has hit a country in which millions are starving and impoverished. South Sudan has the highest poverty rate in the world. 80% of people live on less than $2 a day. Now, food prices are rising. Grain comes from neighbouring countries who themselves import wheat from Russia and Ukraine. Years of armed conflict have meant that very few crops are grown in South Sudan. It's almost totally dependent on imports, and it's often lowest in the food chain.
We're witnessing the worst hunger crisis to date in South Sudan. Over 8 million people are extremely hungry, and this includes tens of thousands of people who could starve if we're unable to reach them with food assistance. We're seeing people's resilience fading in the face of the ongoing conflict, the floods, and rising food prices.
Food packages from aid organisations are reaching only a fraction of South Sudan's 12 million people, many of whom are in great need as the rainy season begins again.
We can take a closer look at this with Martin Frick, Director of the UN's World Food Programme here in Germany. Welcome to DW. If I can start with the fact that your organisation, the World Food Programme, delivers food assistance to more than 80 countries. How are you managing this current situation?
Well, we are administrating a lack, actually. Already in December, we were in the very dire position that in Yemen, we had to cut rations for 8 million people, to take from hungry people to deliver it to the starving. For this year, we estimate that we are 50% underfinanced.
Turning to Ukraine, can you tell us more about what the war means for countries like Egypt or Lebanon that normally get the vast majority of their grain from Ukraine?
That's right. If you look at the map, Ukraine is the closest big grain provider for the Middle East, Northern Africa region. Now, as we speak, 4.5 million tons of wheat are still blocked in the Black Sea ports. And at the same time, the lack of Ukrainian grain, but also unilateral decisions of Russia not to export, has driven up wheat prices in a time when we have already witnessed for last year a steep increase in wheat prices. This is compounded by conflicts, by the effects of COVID that have pushed many African countries so deeply into debts that they can basically not get money on international money markets.
What would you say is the larger problem at the moment? Is it the disruption of wheat production inside Ukraine, or is it the fact that Russia is actually blocking the country's ports and preventing all wheat exports from leaving?
The wheat exports is currently, I think, the bigger problem, and one that could be immediately solved if we had safe access to ships. To give you an idea, before the war, only the port of Odessa has handled 4 grain ships a day with an equivalent of 200,000 tons. And this is now not possible. Neighboring countries, also Austria and Germany, are looking into train transports to compensate, but the capacities are much lower than what ships could deliver. And in addition to that, the space in the silos is being needed for the next harvest, not to risk that this harvest is being lost.
Would you go so far as to say that Russia is deliberately triggering a global food crisis?
Well, we started off in the war speaking about collateral hunger, but issues such as safe passage for ships will be a proof whether this is intentional or it is only, in inverted commas, a side effect of the war.
Now, you mentioned that Germany is trying to help Ukraine ship more supplies via rail. Will that help, and what else needs to be done?
Well, we have estimated that by rail we could maybe get out about 1 million tons of wheat, but in the port cities at the Black Sea, there is at least 4.5 million tons, and the new harvest coming in. So we need fundamentally more capacity to really compensate what has been lost in the last weeks.
Over the past decade or so, the world has made real progress in fighting hunger and malnutrition. In your assessment, has that progress now been lost?
Absolutely, and it's really concerning. 2 years ago, we spoke about 811 million people being food insecure. COVID has certainly added way more than 160 million to that. And now, also with the beginning of the Ukraine war, we unfortunately estimate that even more people pushed into food insecurity. For us, as the World Food Programme, it means when we had to look after basically 150 million people 2 years ago, in January that was already 276 million people, and we are now rapidly approaching 1/3 of a billion people, 330 million people, who are so acutely in food insecurity that they can't do without external help.
Staggering statistics. We'll have to leave it there. Martin Frick with the United Nations World Food Programme, thank you so much for talking with DW.
Thank you.